everybody, so we have another fun review today as we're finally talking about Season 3 of Chucky once again. This time we're talking about Part 2. I know it was quite a long wait between Part 1 and Part 2, but in this instance, I feel it was completely understandable due to the writer's strike and also the actor's strikes interrupting filming. Thankfully, now we're back on track with the series. Of course, this is going to be a spoiler-free review. However, I do spoiler reviews, breakdowns, whatever you want to call them, as the episodes drop, so if that's something that you're interested in going forward, make sure you stay tuned on the channel, like and subscribe. And I'm gonna do my best to answer some questions in the comments. If you do want to leave them, I'll try my best to answer some in a non-spoilery way. How Part 1 of Season 3 concluded, I was intrigued on where exactly the twists and turns of the story would progress into the second half, particularly all the ones swirling around Chucky in particular, because as we saw at the tail end of episode 4, he's continuing to age and rapidly age throughout Part 2, and that alone poses its own issues to go along with the usual Jake, Devin, and Lexi continuing to try and stop him and find Caroline in the process. One of the most fun parts about the Chucky TV series, and talking with you guys a lot in the comment section as the episodes go on, is predicting what's going to happen next. And I must say, I did not expect a lot of the things that transpired in Part 2. Definitely a fascinating contrast tonally and story-wise when you look at what happened in Part 1 versus all the things that happened in Part 2. In terms of structure, Part 1 leaned heavily into building intrigue behind why exactly Chucky's in the White House and what is his plan. Part 2 setup portion of the story is out of the way, but there is this overwhelming sense of urgency within its story in pretty much all of the storylines, but mostly in Chucky's, and feeling the pressure of not having much time left, leading to some pretty crazy moments all around. Because truly, if this is the final time that we see Chucky before he dies 100% this time, no coming back, that coupled with some encouragement from Tiffany, Chucky feels like he may as well go out in a blazing glory. One final massive killing spree, attempting to have the largest amount of casualties we've ever seen in the Chucky franchise to this point. Early on in Part 2, there is this inherent novelty surrounding the fact that Chucky is far older now and dying, but don't be fooled by him being older. That's sure an obstacle for him to get past. But due to his extreme age, it leans into him having to be a tad more creative in the kills department as the episodes go on. It certainly doesn't matter that Chucky is extremely old. The body count is still high, though maybe outside of one kill in particular early on in Part 2, none of them really were as memorable as some of the ones that we got in Part 1. Don't get me wrong though, several of the kills in Part 2 are just as nasty, just not my favorites in comparison. Far less surprise deaths in Part 2. Part 1 had some big surprise deaths. Part 2 has a handful of surprise deaths, but a lot of them you either feel nothing towards or you kind of expected them to die. One of the big surprises about Part 2 that I'm sure you could have gauged from the trailer, and it's something I think fans are going to be kind of mixed upon, is just how heavily Part 2 leans into the supernatural angle. Even I was more so on the fence about it all throughout the 4 episodes, mainly because episodes 7 and 8 are so weird and out there. There's its influences on its sleeve, from films like Insidious or The Shining in particular. The Shining reference is quite obvious with the blood filling up the elevator. The Insidious stuff will make more sense once you watch the episode. Essentially though, the White House in Part 2 is turned into a gigantic haunted house. I'm talking spirits, bloody, gore-filled visions, jump scares. As a concept on paper, that is really fun and exciting, but at least to me, it doesn't feel like it ever fully reaches the full potential with its concept. There were flashes of fun, so I wasn't having a bad time necessarily, but the problems I think could be contributed to a lot of the bigger supernatural stuff coming off as kind of convoluted in the way that it's executed. It almost just feels like everything just starts happening and then things just go off the rails. Eventually, over time, it gets explained a little bit, but the explanations I don't think are the greatest. I really mean it when I say it goes from 0 to 100 off the rails almost instantly. Just getting weirder and weirder until we reach the finale when it just gets the most weird you could ever expect from a Chucky series. Like basically always, the greatest strength in Part 2 does lie in Brad Dourif as Chucky. I know it's so shocking that Brad Dourif as Chucky is the best thing in the show. Truly, you can always rely on him to inject so much life into the material, whether it calls for serious monologues or the plethora of hilarious lines that he's given here, some of which could ruffle some feathers. There's one scene in particular I'm gonna tease a little bit that made me laugh my ass off, and it involves him calling out some other iconic horror movie dolls. I won't say which ones, but one of the dolls he calls out a little bit is the most iconic recent horror movie doll that we've seen him publicly feud with on Twitter. It's stuff like this that I get so much enjoyment out of being a longtime Chucky fan. The meta jokes towards other franchises, on top of fun Easter eggs and references to other entries in the franchise. For instance, one that made me laugh a whole lot. It's kind of a continuation of a joke or a scene, if you will, that happened back in Seed of Chucky involving Santa. It's a sequence I guarantee is going to deliver some big laughs along with the shock value of it all. I mean it though when I say some of the material that Chucky is given in part 2 is so over the top, yet Brad Dourif's performance completely sells it, exploring multiple layers of Chucky now that he's incredibly old. I wasn't sure how this incredibly decrepit old Chucky would work. Don't get me wrong, he is horrible to look at. Anytime he's on screen, he was just disgusting. But I can't deny the overall amusement in how they play into him being so grumpy and slow. The lines of dialogue about him not being able to get it up anymore, if you will, when it comes to killing and the thrill of it all because he's so old and worn down. And despite that though, they do get a little bit creative on how he's utilized, still trying to terrorize the White House. Going in some directions fans I think are going to be surprised by. Like I said, they lean heavily into the supernatural angle of it all. The other neat thing about part 2 is the fact that Brad Dourif actually has some genuine screen time on this, and he's not just voicing a character. You actually see quite a bit of Brad Dourif on screen. Now, I don't want to touch upon too much of his screen time due to the fact a lot of the reason why you see Brad Dourif on screen is heavily into spoilers. So I'll just leave it at I think fans are going to be really impressed by all of the screen time he had. And arguably, I think it's the most screen time he's ever had in the franchise to this point. As for several of the other storylines that are continuing on in part 2, more or less, a lot of them are solid. Tiffany's in particular is about the same, more or less. It's still okay. I totally understand why it's so tough to develop Tiffany's story at all, considering that she's stuck in prison. But I do feel that Jennifer Tilly's performance continues to be top-notch, making her screen time really count despite not having an overabundance of it in part 2. Almost in the same way as Chucky, dealing with her own potential mortality because she is stuck on death row, edging closer and closer to her execution, which you can imagine is a nerve-wracking experience for Tiffany. While also sprinkling in some fun moments here and there. The conversation that she has with Chucky, I think, is one of the best moments that she has in part 2. Fans of Tiffany, I think, are going to be very intrigued on the decisions made here on the future of her character, on top of some of the developments that we have between her and Nika, because Nika does appear at least a little bit in part 2. We'll see Nika pop up in at least half of the episodes. Considering this show has kind of opened the floodgates on bringing back actors who have played other characters in the franchise that have died and having them play new characters. I mean, the biggest example of that is Devon Sawa, who has played different characters in every single season and has managed to die and come back as somebody else. Which that in of itself is an intriguing question on whether or not you think Devon Sawa is actually going to die in part 2 or not. What I'm pertaining it to as far as in part 2 is the fact that John Waters plays a completely different character in part 2. As we saw, he was that weird photographer in Seed of Chucky that got brutally murdered. It's not the same character. It's actually a much more important character as far as the overall mythos of the Child's Play franchise that he's playing here. It's more or less just a cameo. It is fun and campy, and I think fans are going to enjoy it, but don't expect to see a lot of John Waters in the show, at least for now. As much as it pains me to say, because I like their characters so much up until this point, I do think the story overall revolving around Jake, Lexi, and Devon is one of the weaker elements going into part 2. It is this tough balancing act, often lacking focus, as they don't get much development while sharing screen time with the president's family. That storyline also kind of loses steam early on. It was quite nice to see Devon and Jake take some big strides in the future of their relationship, but when it pertains to them as a whole, just kind of growing tired of the rinse and repeat cycle of them chasing after Chucky without much plot progression. By the tail end of season 3, it just feels like the story between them and Chucky has just kind of ran its course. And with how season 3 ends, I do think it opens the door for a lot of interesting possibilities for the future, whether it involves them or not. Though, to be honest, I could definitely see a lot of the big fans of these characters get kind of mad by the way things conclude without giving much away. There's a lot of exciting potential possibilities and directions they could go. It's definitely evident by the end of season 3 that they are trying to set up a season 4 at the least, so we'll see how that goes as far as the future of the franchise. But I do wonder, with how everything concludes in season 3, what a movie could entail while also building up a season 4. While part 2 of season 3 of Chucky is a tad bit all over the place idea-wise, I more or less enjoyed the more supernatural approach taken here. But part 2 of season 3 starts airing back on the USA Network and SYFY channel April 10th, and I cannot wait to delve into a lot more of the spoilers and all the stuff that I couldn't talk about in this review, just because there's a lot of crazy things that I do want to touch upon, but I want them to be fun surprises for you when the episodes start dropping. So if that's something that you're interested in, hearing my spoiler thoughts later down the road, like I said earlier on in the review, stay tuned for that, subscribe, and stick around, because it's going to be a lot of fun talking some more Chucky on the channel with you guys in the coming weeks. And I've heard my thoughts. Make sure you share your thoughts down below. Are you excited for part 2 of season 3? Are you not excited? Make sure you leave a comment, because part of the fun of this is having that conversation with you guys in the comment section. Thank you guys, as always, for checking out the videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure you leave a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel to update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. But next time, I'll see you guys later.